Jeep Willys, the 738R vehicle that won the war on every terrain. Berlin, Germany, March 15, 1943. In a gray concrete building adjacent to Volkswagen's Fallersleben plant, senior automotive engineers from Porsche and Volkswagen gathered around a captured American Jeep Willys MB, retrieved from the North African desert after the fall of Tunisia. Oberingenieur Hans Schmidt circled the vehicle with undisguised disdain, his colleagues nodding as he catalogued its deficiencies. The Jeep weighed 1,110 kilograms compared to the Kübelwagen's elegant 725 kilograms. Its Go Devil four-cylinder engine produced a crude 60 horsepower against the Kübelwagen's refined 25 horsepower air-cooled unit, designed by Ferdinand Porsche himself. The fuel consumption was wasteful, 10 to 12 liters per 100 kilometers versus the Kübelwagen's economical 6 to 7. Most damning to German engineering sensibilities, the Jeep employed unnecessarily complex four-wheel drive, when the Kübelwagen's intelligent rear-wheel drive with limited slip differential and superior ground clearance achieved equivalent off-road performance with half the mechanical complexity. Schmidt ran his hand along the crude welding, the stamped steel body, the utilitarian canvas top that flapped in the wind. "Typical American brute force," he muttered. "They build vehicles like they build everything. Heavy, inefficient, wasteful. Our Kübelwagen is a masterpiece of intelligent design that achieves the same results with elegant simplicity. Why do they need four-wheel drive when proper engineering makes rear-wheel drive sufficient?" His colleagues agreed. Germany had built the finest automobiles in the world: Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Porsche, Auto Union. The Jeep, with its agricultural simplicity and lack of refinement, seemed proof of American inferiority in engineering sophistication. Schmidt filed his report. "Enemy light vehicle demonstrates crude manufacturing, but no technical advancement. Kübelwagen remains superior in all aspects of automotive engineering." The report was filed, noted, and forgotten. None of them realized they were examining the vehicle that would appear in numbers so vast it would redefine the meaning of mechanized warfare itself. What Schmidt and his colleagues failed to understand during their technical analysis was that they were examining one unit of a vehicle that General Dwight D. Eisenhower would later declare one of the three tools that most won the war. And what made the Jeep devastating was not engineering elegance but something Germany could never replicate: democratized mass production at a scale that defied comprehension. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced 639,235 Jeeps, Willys MB and Ford GPW combined, rolling off assembly lines at a rate of 4,000 to 5,000 per week at peak production. Germany, across the entire war, produced approximately 50,000 to 52,000 Kübelwagens. The ratio was 12. 7 American Jeeps for every German Kübelwagen. More devastatingly, the United States shipped approximately 50,000 Jeeps to the Soviet Union via Lend-Lease alone, equaling Germany's entire production. The Jeep cost $738 per unit to manufacture in 1942, roughly one-third the cost of the Kübelwagen, and every single Jeep, whether built by Willys Overland in Toledo or Ford Motor Company in Detroit, was 100% parts compatible. A hood from a Willys fit perfectly on a Ford chassis. An engine from Ford ran flawlessly in a Willys body. This was not a vehicle. It was the industrialization of mobility itself, and it would drown the Axis in a tsunami of mechanized maneuverability they could never escape. The mathematics of Jeep production exposed the fundamental asymmetry that doomed the Axis from the moment America entered the war. In 1941, when the Willys MB was standardized for mass production, American automotive industry was already the most advanced in the world. Henry Ford had pioneered assembly line manufacturing 3 decades earlier, and by 1941, this doctrine of standardization and interchangeability had been perfected across the entire American industrial base. The Jeep embodied this philosophy taken to its logical extreme. In July 1940, the U.S. Army issued specifications for a light reconnaissance vehicle, maximum weight 590 kilograms, 4-wheel drive, capacity for 3 men plus equipment, and impossibly, delivery of a working prototype in 49 days. Only American Bantam Car Company initially responded, a small firm on the brink of bankruptcy. Bantam delivered its prototype in exactly 49 days, an engineering feat that would have been impossible in Germany where automotive production remained semi-artisanal. Willys Overland and Ford Motor Company entered the competition shortly after. The Army tested all 3 prototypes and made a decision that would reshape industrial warfare. Instead of selecting one design, they combined the best features of all 3 into a single standardized specification. Willys provided the powerful Go Devil engine. Bantam contributed transmission and axle designs from Spicer Manufacturing. Ford refined body panels for maximum manufacturing efficiency. The result was a universal specification that any manufacturer could produce using standardized tooling and interchangeable parts. Willys Overland received the primary production contract, and Ford was licensed to produce an identical vehicle designated GPW, government P for 80-inch wheelbase, W for Willys design. By 1942, both companies were producing Jeeps in parallel, and the interchangeability was absolute. A mechanic in France could install a Ford GPW engine into a Willys MB chassis without modification. A damaged Willys hood could be replaced with a Ford hood found in a supply depot hundreds of miles away. This level of parts compatibility was revolutionary and unprecedented in military history. At peak production in 1943 and 1944, American factories produced approximately 4,000 to 5,000 Jeeps per week. To put this in perspective, Germany's entire Kübelwagen production from 1940 to 1945 was roughly 50,000 units. America produced that many Jeeps every 10 weeks. The cumulative total, 639,235 Jeeps, represented 1/4 of all motor vehicles produced by the United States for military use during the war. In terms of light 4-wheel drive vehicles, Jeeps and the related Dodge WC series comprised approximately 64% of the 988,000 units manufactured. The cost efficiency was equally devastating. At $738 per unit in early 1942, a Jeep cost roughly 1/3 of a Kübelwagen, estimated at $2,000 to $2,500 per vehicle. This meant American industry could produce 3 Jeeps for the cost of one German equivalent, and then multiply that advantage by producing 12 times the volume. The mathematics were inescapable. American industry could outproduce German industry by a factor of 36 to 1 in cost-adjusted output. No amount of engineering sophistication could overcome this industrial avalanche. But the Jeep's supremacy was not merely numerical. It was functional versatility multiplied by omnipresence. The Kübelwagen was optimized for personnel transport, and it performed that mission admirably with comfortable bucket seats, superior ride quality from independent torsion bar suspension, and lower fuel consumption. But the Jeep was designed for universal adaptability. It transported personnel adequately, while simultaneously serving as weapons platform, ambulance, artillery tractor, communications vehicle, cargo hauler, and engineering support. A single Jeep could be reconfigured in minutes. Mount a Browning M2, 50 caliber machine gun for offensive operations, remove the windshield and add stretcher brackets for casualty evacuation, attach a trailer hitch to tow a 37mm anti-tank gun or a 105mm howitzer, install communications equipment for mobile command post operations, or load 800 pounds of ammunition and supplies. This operational flexibility meant each Jeep was not one vehicle, but 10 vehicles depending on mission requirements. German units encountering Jeeps discovered this versatility the hard way. In North Africa, British Special Air Service units mounted twin Vickers K machine guns on Jeeps and conducted devastating raids on Luftwaffe airfields, destroying dozens of aircraft in minutes. The Germans called these raiders Jeep Phantoms, fast-moving, heavily armed units that appeared without warning, struck with overwhelming firepower, and vanished into the desert. The Kübelwagen, excellent for reconnaissance and transport, lacked the structural strength and power to serve as weapons platform or heavy towing vehicle. The origin of the Jeep was itself a testament to American industrial pragmatism. In July 1940, with war raging in Europe and American rearmament beginning, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps issued a specification that seemed impossible. Design and deliver a prototype light reconnaissance vehicle in 49 days. The requirements were specific and demanding. 4-wheel drive, 3-passenger capacity, Maximum weight 1,300 pounds, later revised upward. Wheelbase around 80 inches, ability to traverse rough terrain, and simplicity for field maintenance. Only American Bantam Car Company, based in Butler, Pennsylvania, responded initially. Bantam was on the verge of bankruptcy, producing fewer than 2,000 small cars per year. But Chief Engineer Karl Probst saw the military contract as salvation. He worked without sleeping, designing the entire vehicle in 2 days. Bantam delivered its prototype, the BRC-60, in exactly 49 days on September 23, 1940. It weighed 1,840 pounds, exceeding the specification, but it worked. The Army was impressed, but concerned about Bantam's limited production capacity. They invited Willys Overland and Ford Motor Company to submit competing designs, controversially sharing Bantam's blueprints with both companies. Willys delivered the quad prototype in November 1940, featuring a more powerful engine, the 60-horsepower Go Devil 4-cylinder that would become the Jeep's heart. Ford submitted the Pygmy prototype shortly after, with refined body panels optimized for mass production. The Army conducted exhaustive testing through winter 1940-1941, subjecting all 3 vehicles to torture tests over rough terrain, through mud, up steep grades, pulling heavy loads. All 3 performed remarkably, but each had distinct advantages. The Army solution was characteristically American: don't choose, synthesize. They created a unified specification combining Willys's powerful engine, Bantam's transmission and suspension design from Spicer Engineering, and Ford's manufacturing-optimized body panels. Willys Overland received the production contract for 16,000 units in July 1941. Ford was licensed to produce an identical vehicle to share production load. The designation was standardized: Willys MB, military, B for second revision, and Ford GPW, government, P for 80-inch wheelbase, W for Willys design. The first production Jeeps rolled off assembly lines in Toledo and Detroit in late 1941, just as America entered the war. Production ramped up with astonishing speed. By 1942, Willys and Ford combined were producing over 1,000 Jeeps per week. By 1943, peak production exceeded 4,000 per week. The standardization was so thorough that parts were completely interchangeable between manufacturers. A mechanic could swap engines, transmissions, axles, body panels, electrical components, anything, between Willys MB and Ford GPW without modification. This interchangeability meant supply chains were simplified, and field repairs became trivially easy. If a Jeep was damaged, parts from any other Jeep, regardless of manufacturer or production date, would fit. This was industrial warfare doctrine perfected. Germany, in contrast, produced Kübelwagens at Volkswagen's plant in Fallersleben, with semi-artisanal methods and variations between production batches. There was no second manufacturer, no parallel production, no industrial redundancy. When Allied bombers began targeting German factories in 1943 and 1944, Kübelwagen production slowed dramatically. American Jeep production, distributed across multiple factories and supply chains, was essentially immune to disruption. This redundancy was strategic invincibility, translated into manufacturing doctrine. The Jeep's first combat test came in North Africa in 1942. British and American forces operating in the desert immediately recognized the Jeep's advantages over existing vehicles. The British had been using various improvised reconnaissance vehicles and American-made trucks, but the Jeep's combination of four-wheel drive, compact size, and robust construction made it ideal for desert warfare. It could traverse sand dunes that bogged down heavier vehicles. It could be driven at high speed over rough terrain without braking. It carried enough weaponry to defend itself or conduct offensive raids. British long-range desert group and special air service units adopted Jeeps enthusiastically, mounting multiple machine guns and conducting deep penetration raids hundreds of miles behind Axis lines. In one famous operation, SAS Jeeps raided a Luftwaffe airfield at Sidi Hanaish, destroying 37 German aircraft in 15 minutes. The Germans were stunned. Raid reports described small, fast, heavily armed vehicles that appeared without warning, unleashed devastating firepower, and vanished before defenders could respond effectively. German commanders called them Jeep Phantoms, but the most revealing endorsement came from the enemy himself. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps captured numerous Jeeps during the back-and-forth desert campaigns of 1941-1942. German troops immediately preferred captured Jeeps to their own Kübelwagens for specific missions. In sand, particularly deep, soft sand, the Jeep's four-wheel drive provided superior traction compared to the Kübelwagen's rear-wheel drive, even with the German vehicle's limited slip differential and balloon tires. The Jeep's 60-horsepower engine provided significantly more power than the Kübelwagen's 25-horsepower unit, enabling it to maintain higher speeds over rough terrain and carry heavier loads. German mechanized units conducting reconnaissance or rapid maneuver operations preferred captured Jeeps because they were simply more capable for those specific tasks. This created a paradox. German engineers had declared the Jeep inferior, yet German soldiers in the field preferred it. The disconnect between theoretical engineering superiority and practical battlefield performance was a microcosm of Germany's larger strategic failure, confusing technical elegance with operational effectiveness. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, a different story was unfolding, one that exposed an even more devastating dimension of American industrial power. In 1941, as Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Red Army was desperately short of motor vehicles. Soviet industry was capable of producing tanks and aircraft, but had limited capacity for trucks and light vehicles. The USSR operated on a mixed system of trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and commandeered civilian vehicles. Artillery, particularly the excellent Soviet field guns and anti-tank weapons, often had to be moved by horses or tractors, limiting tactical mobility. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Soviet forces were frequently overrun because they could not reposition quickly enough. Then America entered the war, and Lend-Lease began. Among the war materials flowing to the USSR were approximately 50,000 Jeeps, equal to Germany's entire Kübelwagen production. Soviet forces adapted Jeeps as primary artillery tractors for light and medium guns. The 76mm ZIS-3 divisional gun, the 45mm anti-tank gun, and even some 122mm howitzers were routinely towed by Jeeps, giving Soviet artillery unprecedented tactical mobility. Soviet mechanized units could advance, deploy artillery, fire, and reposition in minutes, tactics impossible with horse-drawn guns. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, Joseph Stalin personally thanked Franklin Roosevelt for American Lend-Lease aid. Stalin specifically mentioned Jeeps. Without American Jeeps, the Red Army would have had nothing to pull its artillery. This was not diplomatic flattery, but operational reality. Post-war Soviet military analyses estimated that Jeeps increased artillery mobility by 300% compared to horse-drawn transport. General Georgy Zhukov, architect of Soviet victory from Moscow to Berlin, wrote in his memoirs, "American Jeeps were as valuable as Sherman tanks. They gave us mobility that we could not have achieved with our own production. The scale of Jeep deployment across all Allied armies created psychological effect as devastating as its tactical utility. By 1944, Jeeps were ubiquitous on every front. In Italy, Jeeps navigated mountain roads that seemed impassable to larger vehicles, supplying isolated units and evacuating wounded. In France after D-Day, Jeeps carried radio operators, artillery observers, and military police coordinating traffic. In the Pacific, Jeeps operated in jungles and across volcanic ash where other vehicles bogged down. Every American infantry regiment had dozens of Jeeps. Every artillery battery had Jeeps. Every headquarters had Jeeps. Every engineer battalion, medical company, signal unit, transportation corps detachment, all had Jeeps. German and Japanese soldiers, regardless of theater, encountered Jeeps constantly. They saw Jeeps transporting supplies, carrying wounded, mounting machine guns, towing artillery, laying telephone wire, conducting reconnaissance. The omnipresence created impression of inexhaustible American resources. One captured German officer told interrogators, You destroyed one of our vehicles, and we struggled to replace it. We destroyed one of your Jeeps, and 10 more appeared the next day. How do you fight against that? This was the psychological dimension of industrial supremacy. The Jeep was not just a vehicle, it was a symbol of American abundance made manifest on every battlefield simultaneously. The versatility of the Jeep continued to reveal itself throughout the war. Field modifications and official adaptations expanded its roles far beyond the original reconnaissance mission. Jeeps were fitted with stretchers and became ambulances, evacuating wounded from front lines to field hospitals. They were equipped with radio sets and became mobile command posts, allowing officers to coordinate operations while remaining mobile. They were armed with 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 37mm anti-tank guns, or bazookas, and became weapons platforms. In winter, Jeeps were fitted with skis in place of front wheels, creating improvised snow vehicles. In amphibious operations, Jeeps were waterproofed and driven directly off landing craft onto beaches. In airborne operations, Jeeps were dismantled, loaded into gliders, and reassembled after landing behind enemy lines, providing paratroopers with immediate mobility. Every theater, every environment, every tactical situation revealed new uses. The British fitted Jeeps with desert tires and extra fuel tanks for long-range reconnaissance. The Soviets mounted Katyusha rocket launchers on Jeep chassis for mobile artillery. American engineers used Jeeps to transport demolition equipment and mine detection gear. The Jeep adapted to every mission because its fundamental design, robust, simple, over-engineered for reliability, made it a platform rather than a specialized tool. This was the opposite of German engineering philosophy, which favored specialized vehicles optimized for specific tasks. Germans had separate vehicles for reconnaissance, transport, weapons carriers, and command. Americans had the Jeep, which did all of them adequately and was produced in quantities that made specialization irrelevant. By 1945, the Jeep had become so integral to Allied operations that its absence was unthinkable. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, occupation forces moved into Germany riding in Jeeps. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, American forces occupied Japan in Jeeps. The vehicle that German engineers had dismissed as crude and unsophisticated had carried the Allied armies from North Africa to Berlin, from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo, across every terrain and through every climate on Earth. And in final irony, defeated German soldiers watched American Jeeps drive through their cities in numbers that made mockery of the 50,000 Kübelwagens Germany had managed to produce across 6 years of total war. The Jeep was not the best light vehicle ever designed. The Kübelwagen arguably had superior ride comfort, better fuel economy, and more elegant engineering. But in war, adequacy multiplied by overwhelming quantity defeats perfection, limited by scarcity. The Jeep was adequate, and there were 639,235 of them. Hürtgen Forest, Germany, December 16, 1944. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel stood in his command post observing the opening hours of Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive, Germany's last desperate gamble in the West. His 5th Panzer Army was achieving tactical surprise, overrunning American positions in the snow-covered forest. Through binoculars, Manteuffel watched American units falling back in apparent chaos. But what caught his attention was not the retreat itself, but the manner of it. American soldiers were piling into Jeeps, dozens, hundreds of them, and disappearing down forest roads with astonishing speed. Wounded were thrown onto Jeep hoods and evacuated within minutes. Artillery pieces were hitched to Jeeps and withdrawn before German forces could capture them. Command posts collapsed, loaded into Jeeps, and relocated miles away in less than an hour. Manteuffel, a veteran of both the Eastern Front and North Africa, recognized what he was witnessing. Mechanized mobility so universal that even chaotic retreat remained organized. In contrast, his own forces, despite achieving surprise and initial success, advanced on foot and with horse-drawn supply wagons. His panzer divisions had tanks, but fuel shortages meant they could not maneuver freely. His infantry divisions relied on horses to move artillery and supplies, the same method used in 1914, And interspersed among his mechanized units were a handful of Kübelwagens, useful but limited in capability and desperately scarce. Manteuffel's advance captured dozens of American jeeps intact, abandoned during hasty withdrawals. His orders were immediate. Press captured jeeps into service for German units. Within hours, German reconnaissance units, signal corps, and headquarters staff were driving American jeeps because they were superior to available German vehicles. This had happened in North Africa. It was happening again here. Over the following days, as the Ardennes offensive ground to a halt against stiffening American resistance and fuel exhaustion, Manteuffel wrote in his personal diary, entries later preserved in military archives and studied by historians. One passage dated December 21, 1944, captured his realization. We examined a captured American Jeep in Berlin in 1943 and concluded it was technically inferior to our Kübelwagen, heavier, less fuel efficient, overcomplicated with its four-wheel drive system. We were correct in our technical analysis. The Jeep is inferior in engineering elegance, but we were catastrophically wrong in strategic understanding. The Americans do not need the best vehicle. They need a vehicle that is good enough and exists in overwhelming quantity. They have produced 600,000 of these Jeeps. We have produced 50,000 Kübelwagens. This is not a competition of quality. This is an avalanche of adequate quantity that renders quality irrelevant. Every American unit has Jeeps, plural, not singular. Every German unit dreams of capturing one. When we destroy an American Jeep, 10 more appear the next day. When we lose a Kübelwagen, it takes weeks to replace. We are fighting an enemy that has mechanized mobility for every soldier while we still rely on horses. This is the difference between losing and winning. His conclusion was devastating. The Jeep symbolizes everything we failed to understand about American industrial power. They did not try to build the perfect vehicle. They built an adequate vehicle and produced it in numbers beyond our comprehension. And they did this while simultaneously producing tens of thousands of trucks, half-tracks, tanks, aircraft, and ships. We were so focused on perfection that we forgot wars are won by multiplication of adequacy, not optimization of excellence. The final accounting of the Jeep Willys MB and Ford GPW is written in numbers that still stagger belief 8 decades later. Between 1941 and 1945, American industry produced 639,235 Jeeps, 361,349 Willys MB units, and 277,896 Ford GPW units. Peak production reached 4,000 to 5,000 units per week in 1943 and 1944. In contrast, Germany produced approximately 50,000 to 52,000 Volkswagen Kübelwagens across the entire war. The ratio was 12.7 American Jeeps for every German Kübelwagen. The cost disparity was equally stark. $738 per Jeep versus an estimated $2,000 to $2,500 per Kübelwagen. American industry could produce 3 Jeeps for the cost of one German equivalent. Combining volume and cost advantages, American production efficiency exceeded German production by a factor of approximately 36 to 1. This was not merely superiority, it was industrial annihilation. Approximately 50,000 Jeeps were shipped to the Soviet Union via Lend-Lease, matching Germany's total production. Tens of thousands more went to Britain, Free French forces, and Commonwealth armies. Jeeps constituted approximately 25% of all American military motor vehicles and 64% of light four-wheel drive vehicles when combined with the Dodge WC series. By war's end, Jeeps were operating on every continent, in every climate, performing every conceivable mission from Arctic tundra to tropical jungles. The verdict from the men who won the war was unequivocal. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, was asked in post-war interviews to identify the most important tools for Allied victory. His response: the C-47 transport aircraft, the bazooka, and the Jeep, in that order. The Jeep gave tactical mobility to every unit from infantry platoons to corps headquarters. It was not just transportation, it was a force multiplier that transformed static armies into mobile armies. Eisenhower elaborated in his memoirs, "The Jeep, The Dakota and the landing craft were the three tools that won the war. The Jeep's contribution cannot be overstated. It mechanized mobility universally, giving every Allied soldier access to motorized transport. We did not merely have more vehicles than the enemy. We had fundamentally different mobility doctrine enabled by mass-produced adequacy. Stalin's assessment at Tehran was equally telling. Without American jeeps and trucks, the Red Army would have had nothing to pull its artillery. We could not have achieved the deep operations that destroyed German armies. Post-war Soviet military analyses credited Lend-Lease vehicles, including jeeps, with increasing Red Army mobility by 200 to 300%. General Georgy Zhukov was even more direct. American jeeps were as valuable as Sherman tanks. They gave us mobility that determined the speed of our advance from Stalingrad to Berlin. The enemy's perspective, revealed in post-war interrogations and memoirs, was perhaps most revealing. German General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel wrote extensively about the psychological impact of American industrial abundance. In memoirs published in the 1950s, he reflected, "We captured hundreds of jeeps and immediately incorporated them into our own units, because they were more robust, more versatile, and more reliable than our Kübelwagens." But the true defeat was not technical, it was numerical and psychological. It did not matter how many we destroyed or captured. The Americans always had more. They produced 640,000 jeeps, while we produced 50,000 Kübelwagens. Fighting against this abundance was like fighting the tide of the ocean. Every destroyed jeep was replaced by 10 more. Every German vehicle lost was irreplaceable. By 1944, we knew we could not win because the mathematics were inescapable. Another German officer, whose name was redacted in interrogation transcripts but whose observations were preserved, stated, "The Americans mechanized their entire army while we still relied on horses." In 1944, the Wehrmacht had more horses than motor vehicles. The Americans had a jeep for every squad. This asymmetry decided the war before the first shot was fired. This admission captured the strategic reality. Industrial capacity determined military capability, and American industrial capacity exceeded German capacity by an order of magnitude that made military outcome inevitable. The legacy of the Jeep extended far beyond 1945. Immediately after the war, Willys Overland recognized commercial potential and launched the CJ2A, civilian Jeep, in 1945. It was essentially a militarized MB with minor modifications for civilian use. The CJ2A sold 214,160 units through 1949, establishing Jeep as a commercial brand. Successive generations, CJ3, CJ5, CJ7, sold millions of units globally, creating the entire category of recreational four-wheel drive vehicles. The modern Jeep Wrangler, still in production in 2025, is direct descendant of the 1941 Willys MB, maintaining the same basic design philosophy: simple, rugged, go-anywhere capability. Military adoption continued for decades. The U.S. military used Jeeps through the 1980s until replacement by the HMMNWV, Humvee. Over 50 nations adopted Jeeps post-war for military and civilian use. Licensed production occurred in France, Hotchkiss, Japan, Mitsubishi, India, Mahindra, and numerous other countries. The Jeep became arguably the most influential vehicle design of the 20th century. Not because it was technically superior, but because it was adequately capable, infinitely versatile, and produced in numbers that made it universally accessible. The ultimate lesson of the Jeep is not about vehicles, but about industrial philosophy. The Volkswagen Kübelwagen was, by most technical measures, a more sophisticated vehicle, lighter, more fuel-efficient, more comfortable, designed by Ferdinand Porsche with elegant engineering solutions. In a pure engineering competition, the Kübelwagen would likely win on points. But wars are not engineering competitions. Wars are resolved by multiplication of adequate capability across thousands of simultaneous engagements. The Jeep was not the best light vehicle ever designed, but it was good enough for every mission, and there were 639,235 of them. This abundance transformed adequacy into supremacy. American doctrine understood what German doctrine did not. In industrial warfare, good enough, produced in overwhelming quantity, defeats perfect, limited by scarcity. The Jeep embodied mass production applied to military mobility. Every Allied soldier had access to motorized transport. Every mission could be executed with mechanical assistance. Tactical mobility was democratized, no longer the privilege of elite mechanized units, but the baseline capability of every infantry squad. Germany, in contrast, never escaped dependence on horses. In 1944, the Wehrmacht still employed over 2.7 million horses more than in 1939. While American soldiers rode in jeeps, German soldiers marched on foot, and supplies moved by horse-drawn wagon. This asymmetry, multiplied across millions of soldiers and thousands of engagements, was decisive. Stalin summarized it most succinctly when he told Roosevelt, "This is a war of engines and octane. You have both in abundance we cannot match." The Jeep was the engine that pulled Allied victory across every road, through every forest, over every mountain, and across every beach from Casablanca to Tokyo. It was not perfect, but there were 639,235 of them, and perfection is irrelevant when adequacy is omnipresent.